Good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today for Kennedy Krieger Institute's Exploring the Brain webinar series for our donors and friends. I'm Linda Cameron, Vice President of Philanthropy, and I'll help facilitate today's program. Our topic for this first webinar of 2024 is the extraordinary impact of clinical trials research on neurogenetic diseases. Today's discussion will look at current research and also what's on the horizon for the millions of individuals impacted by diseases and disorders of the developing nervous system. Our program today features Dr. Schlaggar and Dr. Augustine. First, I'm pleased to welcome our President and CEO, Dr. Brad Schlaggar, a pediatric neurologist and neuroscientist. He joined the Institute in 2018. Dr. Schlaggar holds the Zanville Krieger Faculty Endowed Chair and is a professor of neurology and pediatrics at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. At Kennedy Krieger, Dr. Schlaggar leads a team of more than 2,800 staff members, all focused on the organization's mission, which is really to transform the lives of children, youth, and adults with and those at risk for disorders of the developing nervous system through innovative, equity-based, and culturally relevant clinical care, research, education, community partnership, advocacy, and training. In a moment, Dr. Schlaggar will introduce Dr. Augustine and start the program. But first, I'd like to offer a bit of logistical guidance for today's webinar. If you have any questions at any point throughout the webinar, please enter your questions in the Q&A tool of the Zoom. The link for Q&A tool is often found at the top of the screen, depending on your device. And there will be plenty of time for questions and answers in the final segment of the webinar. We will answer as many questions as time allows. So please, if you take a moment and turn your video off and mute your audio for the next portion of the webinar. And then again, please use the Q&A feature if you have any questions or comments. So thank you all so much for being here today for this important discussion, and I will turn it over to Dr. Schlaggar to introduce our first co-host for today's webinar.
Thank you, Linda, for that introduction, and welcome everybody to today's webinar, where we will be discussing how the exciting key advances in specific interventions for rare diseases of the developing nervous system, how they come about, and that's largely through clinical trials research. So I'm excited to be joined by a true expert in this area, my extraordinary colleague, Dr. Erika Augustine. Dr. Augustine is Kennedy Krieger's Associate Chief Science Officer, and she directs the Institute's Clinical Trials Unit. An expert in both rare neurogenetic diseases and in pediatric movement disorders, she also leads the Institute's Batten Disease Clinic, and she's an Associate Professor of Neurology and Pediatrics at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. Prior to joining us in 2020, Dr. Augustine was an Associate Professor of Neurology and Pediatrics at the University of Rochester School of Medicine in Rochester, New York. And there, she co-directed the University of Rochester's Batten Center and was the Associate Director of both the Center for Health and Technology and the Udall Center of Excellence in Parkinson's Disease Research. She's an internationally recognized leader in clinical trials for Batten diseases, which I should say is a group of rare pediatric neurodegenerative disorders. And she has developed a novel telemedicine model to increase the efficacy of remote care for patients with rare diseases. She's highly decorated. She has just recently received the 2023 prestigious Sidney Carter Award from the American Academy of Neurology. That's an award that recognizes outstanding work and service in the field of child neurology. Now, before bringing on Erika, I'd like to set the stage a bit more for our audience today. In our strategic planning work, we identified clinical trials and all the crucial advances in interventions, therapies, and medications they can yield as a necessity and a significant component of the Institute's future. We had a clinical trials unit, but we wanted to reimagine it. Our vision for clinical trial research at the Institute includes a fundamental value and belief that improving access to clinical trials for pediatric patients, especially those with rare neurogenetic diseases, ought to be viewed through an equity lens. We also wanted to create an environment that allows children with more common conditions ready access to clinical trials as well. So it was this vision that led to a national search and ultimately recruiting Erika to Kennedy Krieger so she could lead this critically important effort, essentially reimagining our approach to clinical trials. Now, there are lots of reasons why we were thrilled to attract Erika to Kennedy Krieger, but among those was her longstanding commitment to career development and mentorship, especially for early career stage physician scientists from groups that are historically underrepresented in medicine and science. So the scientific community and Kennedy Krieger needs to build a larger, more diverse and skilled clinical and basic research workforce, especially for neurodevelopmental disorders. So Erika's efforts to support career development benefit not only the emerging physician scientists, but also patients and families now and into the future. So with all that said, welcome, Erika.
Thank you, Brad. It's really nice to have this opportunity to talk with you today, and it's really a delight to be able to work side by side with you to serve the community of people impacted by neurodevelopmental disorders. I'm looking forward to this time today.
Wonderful. So let's start off by talking about your path to this field. I know that I love to ask about origin stories. So what's yours? How did you get started down this path, ultimately leading to your joining us just a few years ago now?
I think I was one of those people who always had an interest and a passion towards becoming a physician. It really was the only career I ever wanted. I liked biology, I liked science, I wanted to help people like we all do. I really wanted to have a way to contribute to my community in a meaningful way. And so for me, that was through medicine. The research part came much later. It really was as I was kind of winding down and residency training and getting into a focus on movement disorders that as I learned about movement disorders, I realized, the kinds of things that I saw in child neurology were just magnified here. We needed more treatments, we needed better treatments, and I wanted to find a way to see myself, to put myself into that research path of creating new treatments. And so long-standing interest, but those lighter pieces came together towards the end of training. And I happened to be in a place that really had great strength in therapy development. I learned a lot and just continued to fuel that passion.
When did that passion for especially rare diseases emerge? Was it during training or subsequently?
That too emerged from my movement disorders training. Movement disorders are conditions that manifest with too much movement or too little movement, or sometimes just difficulty in actually controlling movement. Many people are familiar with conditions that affect adults, movement disorders like Parkinson's disease. What is not always so talked about or not as well known are that there are many different kinds of movement disorders that affect children. And those are typically rare diseases. So very quickly, you go from these common conditions in child neurology to really unique, specific, rare diseases that make up the whole complement of movement disorders. And that's how I gained that interest. And it really kind of paired well with this idea of needing new treatments. So my clinical interests and my research interests, they go hand in hand. And it's rare diseases and therapy development. All of that fueled by this desire to help people. When I'm in the clinic, it's one-on-one or me with a family, but in research, that's scaled up a bit and you get a chance to think about how you might impact many.
So I mentioned that one of your long-term passions is around mentorship and career development, especially related to building a diverse physician scientist workforce. I know that you feel strongly about the mentors that you've had in your career. Can you speak to why it's so important to you and to the field?
It's something that I think is important not only to me personally, but also scientifically. Personally, we become what we can see. When you have a family member, a friend, a community member that pursues a field or a profession, well, you can see yourself there. When you look within your environment and you can look a few career stages ahead, you want to see yourself there. It sort of makes it real that that's possible. And sometimes when I look around medicine, I don't actually see myself reflected. And so personally, it's something that's really important that people have those opportunities to understand what a path of success looks like, to understand that there are options and ways that they can achieve within a field. So that's part of the driver for me. Another driving factor actually is science. If you look in any sector, whether that is education or business or innovation, science itself, we really find that diverse teams and diversity in all of its various forms yield better outcomes. They yield more innovation, they yield more impact. So we know that we have some of the most challenging problems facing us in medicine, facing research, and you really need every mind tackling those problems and every mind with their unique approach to problem solving or unique perspective, weighing in and tackling those issues. So both personally and scientifically, I'm very committed to this concept, this idea of diversity.
So let's talk about research and specifically clinical trial research. What defines a clinical trial and how is a clinical trial different from other forms of clinical research? Of course, we do all of that kind of work at Kennedy Krieger, and the collective work is critical to our overall efforts. But take us through the definitions and distinctions that get at what makes up a clinical trial.
We do use a lot of terms, a lot of phrases to talk about research. You might hear clinical research or preclinical research, clinical investigation, clinical trials. It's a lot of different things. When I'm talking about clinical research, I mean an area of research or an area of science that has to do with the study of health and illness in people. And even though that's a really sort of terse or specific definition, it encompasses a lot of types of research. You could bucket those broadly into observational research, where you might learn about what happens in the course of a disease, natural history. You might try to identify chemicals that can predict outcomes, biomarker development, biomarker research, and many other kinds of observational studies as well. Clinical trials fall in a different bucket. Those are what we call interventional. It means there's some action or some intervention that takes place. Clinical trials are when there is a drug or device, a surgery, therapy, other kind of preventive intervention that takes place in a research context, and the people who have that intervention are followed through to a specific outcome. So clinical trials are a subset of clinical research overall.
We focus, of course, at Kennedy Krieger on disorders of the developing nervous system and some adult disorders too. And I should have said that we're talking about the brain, brainstem, spinal cord, nerve, and muscle comprise the nervous system. A sizable number of the diseases that we see and take care of are rare. One definition of rare disease would be affecting fewer than 200,000 Americans, for example. Let's talk about rare diseases, how common they are. Even though it's uncommon to have a given one, it's common to have a rare disease. And what are the challenges we face in researching therapies, interventions, and so on for rare, especially pediatric diseases?
Well, I think some of those challenges are the challenges of therapy development broadly. The human body is complex. It is a really intricate set of systems. And I think I most have appreciated that complexity at a couple of life phases. You asked about origin stories. I think that understanding of the human body for a physician, a lot of that comes in medical school, anatomy and physiology, really understanding how these interconnected systems work together in these very detailed ways. And another life phase was becoming a parent, where you actually get a chance to experience and up close observe what it is to create a person, to create a human, and then to see them develop and all the variations of what that development can look like. So if you take those experiences and you think about how complicated those aspects are and try to think about how we actually develop a drug or develop an intervention to impact those complex systems in a really specific way, you can imagine just the process of therapy development itself is incredibly challenging. You've got to understand the disease. How does it happen? When does it happen? Why? To whom? You need to have a target. Well, if you understood the disease, how would you want to change it? How would you want to modify the biological processes that happen in that disease? And then you have to prove that something worked. And that's a harder thing than you would imagine. And so those things actually face all therapy development. And then you move to rare disease and things are just magnified. So you need understanding, you need people to tackle those problems, you need innovation and ideas, you need funding and resources to tackle those issues. And for rare diseases, because they impact fewer people for any individual disease, all of that is just a little bit, it can be a little bit less, or the barriers can be a little bit higher, especially on proving something that worked. So there's quite a bit that we have to grapple with as it relates to therapy development in general, and then trying to do that in a rare disease context.
That said, it's important to do the work. And I know you share the idea that I mentioned earlier, that it's important to think about rare disease from an equity perspective. So let's talk a bit about equity and access to trials. What are your thoughts?
It's a real challenge. It's something that we continue, and we meaning the field broadly of those who are pursuing clinical research or clinical trials work, we really try to think about what does that mean to have equitable access to research. For some people, it really starts with an ethical imperative, not only to have equal access to the potential benefits of research, also equal burdens, equal share of the burdens of research as well. And trying to make sure that those are well aligned sometimes doesn't match up with geography. It may be that clinical trials and clinical research, they're often focused at academic medical centers. A lot of academic medical centers have the center of their home in big cities, cities and metropolitan areas. That's not necessarily where everyone lives. So what about individuals who live in rural areas? There are elements that may not be related to geography, but might actually be related to socioeconomic status or education or even employment. Clinical trials often operate on a 9-to-5 kind of schedule in terms of when we do the work, when people are seen. That's time out of work, that's time away from work. That means that there's either a socioeconomic status or an employment that allows for that kind of flexibility to be somewhere else on a business day, during business hours. And so there are ways in which the structure that we've used to create the clinical trial system sort of naturally creates some inequities. And we know that the inequities that we see in the context of care are magnified when it comes to research. So if we can address healthcare inequities, that actually already has an impact on clinical research and allows for us to do better from that standpoint, and the other way as well. If we can expand access to clinical research, we have ways that can impact healthcare access in equitable manners.
We're really living in an era of great interventional promise for the kinds of conditions that you and I went into our medical careers wanting to take care of in pediatric neurology. Can you speak to some of the recent breakthroughs that have occurred because of clinical trials? There's been actually a good number of them recently. Let's talk about a few of them and how those discoveries are changing lives or lifespans.
It's a really interesting time in medicine, and I think especially so in child neurology. The way that we practice today is even different from the way that we trained. It's different from what we would have imagined fast forwarding 10, 20, 30 years. There have been these leaps in advancement of how we diagnose conditions, how specific we are able to be in terms of what condition someone has and being able to talk with families about that. How did the diagnosis come about, or how did the disease come about? What to expect? We're in a whole new place for that. And we also are in a new place therapeutically. I'll give a couple of examples. This past year, the first approved treatment ever for Rett syndrome was approved by the Food and Drug Administration in the United States. Rett syndrome is a genetic neurodevelopmental disorder that predominantly affects girls, although there are ways in which Rett syndrome affects boys as well. And it is a severe condition. It's really been intractable. And for the first time, there is a treatment that is targeted to the core symptoms of this condition. And I think, again, the person who and the people who work to not only discover the cause and discover the gene, have been able to see that through into the development of therapies. Some of our colleagues at Vanderbilt led the overall study. Dr. Jeff Newell led the national study that led to that approval. And here at Kennedy Krieger, Dr. Connie Smith-Hicks led our site and our ability to offer that opportunity and to shepherd the science here, participation in that trial. And having that approval actually means a lot of things, not only the improvement for that specific therapy, but a lot of the ways that we go about conducting research going forward. There was another approval the prior year for cerebral adrenoleukodystrophy. This is a severe progressive disorder that affects the white matter of the brain. And like Rett syndrome, again, severe, debilitating condition that causes a shortened lifespan and many neurological impacts. There's a gene therapy now approved for treatment of this condition. And so having these options, efficient diagnosis, and then something that we can do to intervene right away is incredibly meaningful in the moment for families and incredible for the impacted person long-term in terms of alleviating some of those symptoms. And beyond that, often there's meaning for how we conduct research in a variety of ways when there's been a new approval. So just a couple of examples, but there are a lot of ways in which how we practice child neurology, how we provide care is dramatically changing.
I can't help but to mention that the two conditions that you brought up, Rett syndrome and childhood onset cerebral adrenoleukodystrophy, are conditions that are really at the root of this Kennedy Krieger Institute legacy. Hugo Mosier, Dr. Mosier, Dr. Sakubai Naidu, Dr. Michael Johnston. These are giants in our field who were really instrumental in laying the foundation for the work that has led to now real interventions that change the course of these conditions that when we were in training, we thought would be intractable. So really consequential work coming out of this institute. So some of the
just like you said, those foundations, what is the disease? How does it occur? Why does it occur? What are the biochemical pathways? That work, as you said, really from Kennedy Krieger has now sparked a whole generations, several generations of research now leading to impactful treatments. And to be able to see that come back to the patients for whom we provide care, it's just a wonderful full circle to see that come together.
So what would you say would be, so for a layperson, for example, to think about clinical trials for rare neurological diseases, why it would matter to somebody who's not directly impacted by one of those conditions? So for example, are some discoveries that come from the work generalizable to other kinds of conditions?
I think there's so many levels at which learning takes place for any one trial. There's always the primary focus on the people with the condition of interest, how the specific drug or intervention is working. Is it safe? Is it effective? And those are the primary questions. But the secondary things that we learn sometimes have to do with the disease. So in the case of Rett syndrome, for instance, that we talked about, we know now more about how to measure the condition. There are a group of investigators who have all worked together and have collaborated and know how to move studies forward. For other rare diseases that aren't Rett syndrome, there are models of how to think about that, how to actually build the infrastructure needed, how to go about testing certain kinds of behaviors so others can actually learn from what we advanced there. Sometimes it has to do with related conditions. There are these growing recognitions of links between rare genetic diseases and risk for common adult onset diseases. There are links between a genetic rare disease and risk for Parkinson's disease, genetic childhood onset disease or congenital diseases, and Alzheimer's disease. And so being able to have those biochemical or genetic risk links may help us in the near future to start to think about targeted therapies for subsets of people who have specific adult onset conditions. So those relationships are becoming increasingly important. Learning about the science of a rare disease is actually helping us learn about the science of more common diseases as well. And then I think that last piece has to do with, the last two pieces, I should say. One is about the drug. Certain drugs can be applied in different settings. Sometimes we call those platform therapies, or perhaps there is one aspect that can be modified from the way it was used in one context to actually then apply that in a new context, and ideally accelerate the way in which we develop therapy. And then finally, well, how do you actually get things approved? What is the process? What is the roadmap? We try to learn from every study and how we do that.
You mentioned a little while ago that, for example, the Rett syndrome treatment, the primary site was at Vanderbilt. We had a site at Kennedy Krieger. So that it's referencing a collaborative approach, a multi-site approach to these trials. How does that work? How does a clinical trial, a multi-site collaboration happen? Is it a necessity, and what's the benefit of that approach?
It often is a necessity. There's so much complexity to how a clinical trial goes from idea to implementing the trial to then even evaluating the evidence and submitting that for review and ideally approval by the Food and Drug Administration. There are the teams that actually conduct the day-to-day operations. There are the groups that collect the data and provide the data quality assurance, data analysis. There's the drug manufacturer and the way that it actually gets to people. There are just many, many, many roles that come together to make any clinical trial happen. Sometimes that's all in one place. Increasingly, that knowledge is so specialized that you'll find that knowledge in different places. And so that collaboration is necessary. Also, sometimes it's a recruitment question. You may not actually be able to enroll all the participants needed to test the scientific questions at hand from one place or one region. It may require a national or even international scope of recruitment. One of the benefits of that, again, is it increases the opportunities for participation in research. It ideally increases the diversity of the individuals who engage with the research. And when the research pool is highly representative of the population, the more trust we can have in those answers and those results, and the more likely it is that those results are what we call generalizable. When you move from the very specific trial setting into everyday practice, the more those people are reflective of who you might see, the more you actually can trust that the results apply to your patient population that you're seeing, the people you see face-to-face in the clinic. So a lot of collaboration is necessary, and these days almost required to be able to move trials forward. And there are different structures for doing that. Some of them are academic consortia, like something called NeuroNext, the Network for Excellence in Neuroscience Clinical Trials. That is a funded, NIH-funded network that focuses on neurological conditions. We are a site in that consortium. There are many others, some for stroke or oncology or emergency medicine. Lots of ways that there are structured collaborations that are ready to move forward new ideas, and ones that come together based on a foundation or a disease interest or other things as well.
So what do you see as on the horizon that's exciting, that may be already showing some promise for the next intervention that's coming? I mean, people are likely aware of, for example, of the CRISPR work that has made it possible to treat sickle cell disease directly as an intervention. What do you see as exciting on the horizon?
Well, I think it's ideas like those. It's being able to translate the knowledge that we have now, especially for rare diseases, where there's clear understanding that a large proportion of rare diseases come about due to changes in genetic changes or genetic mutations or variants. And we can identify specific genes associated with specific conditions. And now we have proof of concept in a few different ways that we can either provide a correct copy of that gene that has an error in its coding, or we can manipulate that gene in a way that allows for it to do its job either accurately or close to accurately in a way that helps people. Or in the case of CRISPR, as you've said, we have machinery that actually can correct the error, and that we can do that in a targeted and precise manner. And so once you've shown that you can do that in 1 or 2 or 3 sets of conditions, the possibility opens up for all of the ways that you might be able to use those gene-targeted tools to intervene for people who are impacted by genetic conditions, whether they're rare or common. And so each of these approvals, you ask that question about, well, if I don't have a rare disease, does this matter for me? The CRISPR approval is something that matters for all of us. The approval for cerebral, adrenoleukodystrophy matters for all of us. Each one of us will have a medical condition of some sort in life. We either have it already, we had it in the past, or it's coming. And you want to know that scientific advances in one arena, if they can be applied, that there's been a learning of the know-how in terms of creating and developing it, know-how in terms of safety and maintaining safety of the people who receive it, and then know-how in terms of being able to go from an idea to something that's approved and can get to you when you have a time of need quickly. And so all of these approvals actually matter quite broadly. And I'm really excited to know that when it comes to gene-targeted therapies, there are a lot of people, a lot of organizations who are working to make this a more efficient process, working to learn how to share information and share knowledge so that, again, we can really learn well from one another and bring those ideas to fruition in the clinic. And it's just a time of rapid advancement, which is really exciting, which means meaningful impact for patients and families. So I'm delighted to see that. And there's a new kind of innovation that's happening as well. What happens if you're one person with something that's really unique or exceptionally rare? Do you have to wait for 500, 1,000, 5,000 people to have the same thing that you do? Or are there ways that actually in your lifespan or in the time of your disease that researchers might be able to try to create something targeted for you? And that also is a growing movement. That's really exciting.
So before we open it up to our audience for questions, and I hope you're able to put to the audience, put some questions into the Q&A. If you had a magic wand, say, and you could knock down or take care of the most significant obstacles to get more rapid advances for treatment answers for rare neurologic diseases, what would you say? What would you take on with that magic wand?
I think a couple of areas. One would be ways that we can learn from each other more quickly. Research, as much as we try, still in a lot of ways happens in silos. And there's a lot that kind of happens with one group or in one area and doesn't always get shared in the way that we'd like, or doesn't always get shared in a way that's useful. And so having paths that create a precedent or information that many groups can use would rapidly accelerate things. The second magic wand would be that we would actually be able to implement more quickly as well. And that would be hugely impactful. There's still a lag or a gap between when there's a new discovery or a new approval and when that gets available and is there and ready for everyone. Some of that takes some new know-how in terms of how to actually use a new treatment. And so my magic wands would be at two ends. On the first end, when there's new information, how do we get that to everyone? And on the other end, when we have new therapeutic options, how do we make that happen instantly?
So we can turn to some questions. And one question is, I think you triggered with this point about if you're the only person with this particular disease, sometimes we call it N of 1 disease. Can you take us through, like, what does that mean exactly? What does it mean to have a clinical trial, for example, that is based around a single patient? What does that look like?
So, I would go back to definitions again. We talked about clinical research and clinical trials, and I think I would start with the idea of personalized medicine versus individualized medicine. Personalized medicine may be a term that people are familiar with over the last couple of decades even. We've talked about this idea that, people are unique. They have unique circumstances in terms of health, unique coalescence of different conditions. And ideally, one's physician is able to take into account all of that and look at all of the resources available and pick the optimal treatment cocktail, the optimal path for a specific person. So taking the tools available, come up with the right treatment cocktail for one person. Personalized medicine. Individualized medicine is a little bit different. And it's thinking about the unique aspects or the unique causes of a specific disease, often unique genetic cause for one person or a small group of people for a disease, and creating the strategy anew, creating a novel therapeutic intervention. Doesn't exist, it's not approved. How do you actually develop something custom or bespoke or targeted for that person? And there have been a couple of examples of this, and it's a rapidly evolving area. And I think the issues at hand are, well, when is this appropriate? How do we make sure that there really is a unique circumstance? Because we have pathways for creating treatments for many people impacted by the same disease. How do you know that you're really sort of dealing something with unique that's affecting an individual person? When is it ethically appropriate? How do you garner the resources to stand up that kind of infrastructure and trial for one person or a very small number of people? How do you know if something worked? How long should someone be exposed? That's actually a really big question. Again, did it work? Seems like it should be obvious, and it's not always so obvious. And I think that's especially challenging in this context. And then long term, our regulatory system was built on the idea that drugs need approval, then to be marketed to people and used in clinical practice broadly. Well, if you've created a unique treatment for a very small number of people or for one person, well, what does that mean for that to have a regulatory approval? And so there's some real questions there. The reason this is even a question has to do with our advancements in genetic diagnosis and our genetic knowledge, and advancements in those gene-targeted therapy tools that I was talking about, where there's a platform, a base, a structure for the ways in which we can interact with and impact the genome and modify that in ways that improve health. So it's a new kind of question that we didn't have before. It's the advancement in scientific tools that even makes it a possibility.
So a really compelling question. For some types of clinical trials, especially those involving genetic material, DNA, for example, there are moral and ethical issues that arise. How are those reviewed, thought through, justified? What's the approach?
A lot of the initial questions have to do with safety. Trying to make sure that we have as much information as possible about the safety of a specific genetic intervention before we move into trials that involve people. It's critically important that we, again, have as much knowledge as possible. For some gene-targeted strategies, they can be temporary, meaning we need to give them repeatedly, even though they act on genetic material. They have an on and off sort of effect. And those are much more like drugs in the way that we're used to thinking about them. But some gene-targeted therapies are really designed in a way that is, in today's world, one-time kind of administration. And you don't necessarily have ability to take it back, so to speak, or to stop giving it. Once it's been given, it's given for an enduring kind of period. And so having an understanding of what those impacts might be is really, really important. And there are standards and processes for what kind of evidence is required before human trials start. And then within trials that involve people, there are various levels of safety oversight as well, both at, whether it's at the level of the site, at the level of the sponsor, or even a data and safety monitoring board that receives information about safety and efficacy throughout a study. So a lot of those kinds of questions, but then also some other ethical dilemmas that arise as well.
A real world question also is about the expense of the treatments that are emerging from these trials for rare diseases. Why are they so extremely expensive when they come to market? And are there ways to tamp down those costs? Why are they so expensive?
For some of those interventions, they're difficult to make with high quality and high purity, or there may be a relatively small number of manufacturing sites that actually make those kinds of products. So I think in contrast to certain kinds of therapy development, small molecules or pills that we're, again, used to seeing developed, these actually have very specialized manufacturing processes that are actually quite costly. And so that's one aspect of high cost, making them, it costs more. Another aspect of cost is how they're developed, the trials infrastructure, the requirements, the number of people needed to run those studies. They can be large studies. And then the other question has to do with, we have these broader issues of drug pricing in not only rare disease, not only in highly specialized interventions, but really as we think about drug pricing broadly, at least in the United States, it's an ongoing challenge and an issue. And so, as I said, that the complexities of developing an intervention are magnified in the rare disease context, the drug pricing issue is magnified in a rare disease context. And so how you address it and how you go forward, there are a lot of ideas being developed about how to tackle this. Some of those have to do with newer reimbursement strategies, whether that has to do with proving effect. This is what was purported to be the effect in trial. Reimbursement may be based on meeting those milestones. But there's a lot of thought and effort into trying to think about how we address this question as a society, because as I said, there are interventions that will scale and grow to many. It's one thing to have a few extremely high cost drugs. It's another to actually have them reach their full potential and have the few go to hundreds or thousands of potential interventions. We need a structure and a plan to be able to sustain that and support that financially.
Yeah, agreed. Part of I think, question about expense has to do with what some might call a failed clinical trial. If the trial at the completion of it does not show a result that says, yes, this is an intervention that's beneficial, is that a waste of resources if a trial shows a null response?
It's important if the answer is definitive. So when you conduct a clinical trial, you have a question. Is compound X safe and effective? And you want to have a definitive answer to that question. If you knew with certainty that something worked well, you wouldn't need the trial. And so we have to prove and demonstrate that the outcomes are indeed what we think or what they hope they are. And if they are not what we think and what we hoped for, with certainty to understand, well, where is reality? And so ideally, a trial has an answer of yes to the questions at hand, or no to the questions at hand. Sometimes, we focus a lot on trial design, how to conduct studies well in a timely manner and to recruit appropriately and to really answer the questions, because a disappointment is when the answer is maybe, and when there isn't that certainty and you haven't been able to answer the scientific question. That's the part that can be a major disappointment or a potential waste of resources. But if there's a definitive no, that's important as well, because that means that you tested an intervention, you've evaluated its outcomes, and you know with certainty this is something that should be continued to scale up and be given to more people, or it's something that should not, or it needs to be done in a very different way. So a definitive answer is a worthwhile investment.
You know, a follow-up on that question is, there was a time when, especially pharmaceutical companies might not report or publish their negative results, but the climate has changed a bit. Could you speak to what are the requirements for clinical trials for full reporting that has emerged?
So clinicaltrials.gov is an open, available website that is an important resource for understanding trials that are happening, at least in the United States. Sometimes other kinds of clinical research can appear there as well, but there's a requirement for most, not all, but most clinical trials to be registered with clinicaltrials.gov as the study is starting or before the study is starting in many cases. But it's a very short window of what that requirement looks like. And there, the study needs to share some information about who is the target population, what is the intervention or the nature of the intervention, who is the sponsor, where is the study happening, what is the general design of the study, and updates about the status of the study throughout the study on a somewhat regular basis. And at the end of the study, there's a requirement to actually register those results and outcomes, the main outcomes that were listed in the original registration, to bring those there. And the protocol actually now needs to be registered there as well. These have been requirements that have been rolled out in a staged manner. So you may go to that site today, see some studies from several years ago that may not have results yet or may not have a protocol listed, but over time, there's increasing compliance so that this can be a resource for information, even if there's never a publication in a journal. That's not a step that's actually required. So the idea of this registration portal is that people should have information about research. They should be able to access information about outcomes in an open, fair, equitable manner. And this is one step in that direction to try to achieve that. It's one of a number of strategies, but it's probably the one that applies the most broadly for interventional research that involves a drug or a biologic or a device.
So here's a question, and this may be our final one, and I realize I should have asked this earlier on and more directly, but what exactly is a clinical trials unit, and who's working there? What are the different kinds of roles? And then at this instant, for example, how many different clinical trials are you managing in that unit?
So clinical trials unit might look different in different places. And at Kennedy Krieger, or actually anywhere, the trials unit is there to try to serve the needs of the environment as it relates to therapy development. And again, those environments are going to be different. The needs are going to be different. At Kennedy Krieger, we really think about patient population, we think about investigators, and we think about making research possible. And that requires a few things in terms of infrastructure. You need a space for that to happen. You need a central sort of coalescing force that if you're a clinician or a researcher and you have an idea to bring forward a new trial, or a pharmaceutical company comes to you to share in the idea that might be moving forward, like some of the studies that we mentioned, if you don't already have an existing research group ready to deploy, you need some resources for that. And so at Kennedy Krieger, there was the foresight to create such resources. And a lot of that has to do with people, knowledge, and know-how. And those elements come in a variety of forms. That might be a clinical research coordinator with deep expertise in how to start and operate clinical trials. Our research coordinator team, a lot of them not only have deep knowledge around project and program management, the majority of our clinical research coordinators have backgrounds in neuroscience, in neurodevelopment, or in childhood behavior. So it's a really unique and a really special group that is optimally suited for the population who we serve at Kennedy Krieger. I'm really privileged to work with this group of individuals. And they know clinical trials inside and out. So if you're a new investigator and you're coming with knowledge about the science, You're coming with knowledge about the patient population that's really well matched with a coordinator team who actually knows the ins and outs of clinical trials. And together, you form a team that actually can operate at a high level of quality and efficiency from the very beginning. We also work with investigators around design. Sometimes investigators have an idea, they haven't designed clinical trials, or they need space and infrastructure, or they need financial contracting budgeting support. So we really tried to think about what are some of the array of options and array of resources that are needed. We embedded that into a clinical trials unit, and we make that available to investigators across the entire institute. We're a team of 15 individuals of a variety of roles. And right now, in conjunction with some of our colleagues in the Neuromuscular Center, our colleagues in Neurogenetics, we run 40 studies, 40 clinical trials across the institute of a variety of conditions. It's a really exciting time to see that grow.
Well, Erika, thank you so much for joining us today. And for our audience, I hope you found this webinar to be informative and thought-provoking, and I'm sure you understand why we are so excited and delighted to have Dr. Erika Augustine on our Kennedy Krieger Institute team. You can also see how excited this topic exciting it is for both of us. This is why we got into child neurology in the first place. That's actually true of our entire team of investigators throughout the Institute who are working every day to help kids pursue all that's possible.
Well, thank you, Dr. Schlaggar, and thank you, Dr. Augustine, and many thanks to everyone who joined us today. We will send a link to today's recording to our guests by email, and we hope that you feel free to share it with your friends and family and post it on social media. If you have any questions about today's webinar or you wish to learn more about the content discussed, please send us an email at foundation@kennedykrieger.org. And additionally, if you're interested in supporting these efforts with a gift, please email us at the same address to discuss this, or please scan the QR code on this screen. So we thank you again, and I hope you will join us for our next Exploring the Brain webinar this spring. Thank you.